What if the most dangerous enemy the Vikings ever faced was not war, not hunger, not even death itself, but the cold, silently creeping into their homes, waiting to claim them while they slept? The cold does not announce itself with a roar. It whispers. It seeps. It presses its invisible fingers into bone and breath alike, slowing the heart, clouding the mind, stealing life inch by inch. In the far north, where the sun vanishes for weeks and the land turns to iron beneath a crust of ice, cold is not a season. It is a force. A predator. And for centuries, it has erased entire communities from history without leaving a single scar on the earth to mark their passing. Yet somehow, against everything nature intended, Viking villages endured. They did not merely survive winters that shattered trees and froze oceans, they lived through them, year after year, generation after generation. Children were born while blizzards screamed outside. Elders died of age, not exposure. Fires burned when logic said they should fail. Walls held warmth when the world beyond them sought only to drain it away. These villages did not freeze. Not when the winds howled like beasts. Not when the ground itself turned hostile. Not even when the Arctic night swallowed the sky whole. And that should unsettle you. Because this survival was not accidental. It was not luck. And it was not simple toughness or brute endurance. Viking villages were not random collections of houses scattered across a frozen wilderness. They were carefully conceived systems designed, refined, and perfected with a singular obsession in mind, defying the cold. To understand how they did it, you must abandon the comforting modern belief that warmth comes from machines, switches, and endless fuel. The Vikings had none of these. No central heating. No insulation panels. No glass windows sealed tight against the wind. What they had instead was something far more dangerous and far more powerful: knowledge earned through loss. Long before the villages that archaeology would one day uncover, there were settlements that failed. Homes where families never woke up. Structures that trapped cold instead of resisting it. Poor choices that meant death before spring. The Viking world was built on the bones of these mistakes. Every beam placed, every wall angled, every doorway positioned was informed by generations who learned, brutally, what the cold would exploit if given the chance. Because cold is patient. It searches for gaps. It powers through cracks no wider than a finger. It rides the wind down corridors, under roofs, across floors. It steals heat not in dramatic bursts, but through relentless contact, draining warmth from bodies until fire itself feels weak. And the Vikings knew this. They respected it. More importantly, they planned for it. A Viking village was not simply a place to live. It was a shield. From a distance, such villages may have appeared humble low shapes crouched against the land, roofs heavy, walls thick, paths winding without obvious order. But this apparent simplicity was deception. These settlements were engineered environments, designed to manipulate wind, trap heat, conserve energy, and create pockets of livable warmth in landscapes that should have been lethal. The story begins not with the house, but with the land. Vikings did not choose village locations for beauty. They chose them for survival. Elevation mattered, but not too much. Valleys offered protection from wind, but could become cold traps where dense air settled and froze everything it touched. Open plains invited storms. Cliffs amplified gales. The perfect site balanced exposure and shelter, often nestled near slopes that could break wind without smothering sunlight. And sunlight, however rare, was life. Even in the depths of northern winters, the angle of the sun mattered. Villages were positioned to catch what little light the sky would offer, stretching days by precious minutes. Snow reflected that light, bouncing it toward walls and roofs, warming surfaces just enough to matter. Every flicker of warmth was counted. Nothing was wasted. But location alone could not save them. The real secret lay in how Viking villages were arranged, not as isolated homes, but as interdependent organisms. Buildings were clustered close, not for community alone, but for thermal defense. Each structure shielded the next. Walls blocked wind. Roof lines diverted gusts upward. Narrow paths twisted deliberately, breaking the momentum of icy air that would otherwise charge straight through the settlement like a blade. There were no wide, welcoming streets for winter to exploit. Cold wind loses strength when forced to turn, to slow, to collide with obstacles. Viking villages forced it to do all three. What remained by the time it reached the heart of the settlement was weakened, fractured, manageable. The village itself acted like a maze designed not for people, but for the cold, and the cold always lost. At the center of this defensive design stood the longhouse. More than a home, the longhouse was the thermal core of Viking life. It was where families slept, worked, ate, and endured together. Its size was not excess, it was strategy. Larger interior spaces allowed heat to circulate rather than escape. Fires burned centrally, their warmth radiating outward, shared by many bodies instead of lost to isolated rooms. And bodies mattered. Human heat was not incidental. It was calculated. The presence of people, animals, and fire within the same structure created a layered warmth that no single source could provide alone. Livestock were often housed within or adjacent to living spaces, separated by walls thin enough to allow heat transfer but thick enough to block smell and disease. The animals survived. The people stayed warm. Nothing existed in isolation. The walls themselves were weapons against winter. Viking builders favored thickness over height. Turf, stone, wood, and earth were layered together into walls so dense that cold struggled to penetrate them. These materials did not merely block wind, they absorbed heat slowly and released it even more slowly, stabilizing interior temperatures through long, dark nights. Once warmed, these walls remembered. Roof designs followed the same philosophy. Steep angles shed snow before it could crush the structure, yet enough snow remained to act as insulation, trapping warmth beneath a white, silent blanket. Inside, smoke from fires was not rushed out immediately. It lingered, heating rafters, drying wood, sealing gaps with soot that further blocked drafts. Nothing was accidental. Even doorways betrayed Viking paranoia about the cold. They were small, low, awkward. A visitor had to bend to enter, a minor inconvenience that doubled as a major defensive feature. Cold air sinks. Low doors reduced the volume of freezing air entering the home, while forcing warm air to remain trapped above. Sometimes, doorways were offset or shielded by walls, preventing direct wind from rushing inside. Windows, when they existed at all, were tiny and rare. Darkness was preferable to death. Inside these homes, the atmosphere was heavy, warm, alive. Sounds were muted. Fires crackled softly. Breath did not fog endlessly. While storms raged outside with murderous intent, life continued within these earthen wombs. Meals were cooked. Tools were repaired. Stories were told. Children slept. And that is perhaps the most disturbing part of all. The Vikings did not merely endure winter in constant misery. They adapted so completely that winter became routine. The cold was still feared, still respected, but it no longer ruled them. Their villages transformed the most hostile environment on earth into something survivable, even livable. This raises an unsettling question. If people with no modern technology, no scientific instruments, and no external fuel sources could design villages that resisted Arctic winters so effectively, what knowledge have we forgotten? What instincts have we lost? And how many of our modern comforts are illusions, masking a deeper vulnerability the Vikings would have found unthinkable? Because their villages did not freeze by accident. They were designed not to. And as we move deeper into this story, you will see that architecture was only the beginning. Beneath the walls and roofs lay cultural rules, daily rituals, and unspoken laws that turned survival into habit. The village was the body, but its people were the heartbeat. And winter was always listening. What if a Viking village was never meant to stand still but to breathe, adapt, and fight the cold like a living creature? To the untrained eye, a Viking settlement appears frozen in time, low buildings hunched beneath the sky, paths worn into the earth, walls heavy with soil and age. But this stillness is an illusion. In truth, a Viking village was in constant motion, responding to winter the way a living organism responds to pain by tightening, conserving energy, and redirecting its strength where it mattered most. The cold did not attack all at once. It probed. It tested. It searched for weakness. And the village answered every challenge with quiet, relentless efficiency. As winter approached, the village changed its behavior. Paths that were lively in summer grew narrower as snow piled deliberately where it was least useful. Snow was not always cleared. In many places, it was allowed to accumulate against walls, forming natural insulation. Children were warned not to disturb these banks. What looked like neglect was in fact protection, layers of compressed snow sealing warmth inside earthen walls like a second skin. Movement through the village slowed, not from weakness, but intention. The Vikings understood that every unnecessary step into the cold cost heat. Energy was life, and life was not squandered. Work was reorganized. Tasks were centralized. Instead of traveling between distant structures, winter life contracted inward. The village folded in on itself, reducing exposure, minimizing risk. Even sound changed. In winter, voices were lower. Laughter was quieter. Doors were opened less often. Every action acknowledged an unspoken truth: the cold was always waiting for an invitation. And the village denied it entry wherever possible. The placement of buildings followed rules never written, but never broken. Storage houses were positioned downwind, acting as sacrificial buffers against icy gales. Workshops faced away from prevailing winds, their entrances shielded by neighboring walls. Living spaces were always the most protected, buried deepest within the settlement's defensive geometry. Nothing stood alone. The longhouse did not dominate by size alone, it anchored the village's thermal network. Heat from its hearths radiated outward, warming adjacent structures through shared walls and sheltered corridors. Smaller buildings leaned against it, borrowing warmth the way animals huddle together in a storm. This closeness bred survival but also discipline. A single poorly maintained roof could doom a family. A gap in one wall could funnel cold into others. The village's warmth was communal, and so was responsibility. Repair was constant. Thatching was checked. Turf was replaced. Cracks were filled not when they became dangerous, but before they had the chance. Neglect was not a personal failing. It was a threat. Winter magnified every mistake. A door left ajar could freeze a room in minutes. Damp wood could steal heat faster than stone. Wet clothing, if not dried properly, could turn a survivable night into a lethal one. Viking villages responded to this reality with routine so strict it bordered on ritual. Fires were never allowed to die completely. Even when fuel was scarce, embers were preserved like living beings. Ash was carefully banked. Coals were shared between homes if needed. Fire was not owned, it was guarded collectively, passed like a sacred trust from night to morning. Inside the longhouse, heat moved upward, and the Vikings followed it. Sleeping platforms were raised, keeping bodies above the coldest air. Tools and supplies were hung overhead, drying in warmth while remaining within reach. Children slept closest to the fire, elders nearest the walls where heat was more stable and smoke less thick. Even rest followed thermal logic. Smoke itself became an ally. It blackened beams, sealing wood against moisture. It repelled insects that could damage insulation. It dried the interior air, making warmth more effective. What would be considered unhealthy by modern standards was, in this context, survival engineering refined over centuries. The village adapted its diet to match its environment. Winter food was dense, fatty, and warm. Meals were timed to generate heat when it was needed most. Eating before sleep was not indulgence, it was insulation from the inside out. The body became another hearth, burning slowly through the night. Clothing was not removed indoors. Modern logic would say warmth means comfort, and comfort means shedding layers. Viking logic said warmth must be preserved at all costs. Clothes stayed on. Heat stayed trapped. The body never cooled enough to invite the cold's return. Even silence served a purpose. In deep winter, the village listened. Wind direction was noted. Temperature shifts were felt before they were seen. A change in sound against the walls could signal a breach in insulation or a collapsing roof. Awareness was constant, but never panicked. The village trusted its design and its habits. This trust did not come from optimism. It came from memory. Every family carried stories of winters that killed, of villages that vanished, of people found frozen where they stood, victims not of storms, but of small errors repeated too long. These stories were not told to frighten children, they were told to teach them. Winter was not evil. It was honest. And the Viking village responded with honesty of its own. No wasted space. No wasted movement. No wasted heat. Every element of daily life was aligned toward a single goal, staying alive without surrendering dignity. The village was not merely a collection of structures. It was a system of shared warmth, shared vigilance, and shared fate. And yet, even with all this preparation, the Vikings knew one truth above all others: architecture and habit could only slow the cold, not defeat it entirely. To truly survive Arctic winters, they needed something more subtle. Something that could outlast storms, darkness, and despair. They needed control over time itself. And that secret lay not in the walls but in how the Vikings prepared long before the first snow ever fell. What if the Vikings survived the cold not by fighting winter when it arrived but by defeating it months before the first snow ever touched the ground? Winter, to the Viking mind, was not a season. It was an inevitability. A certainty so absolute that ignoring it even briefly was an invitation to death. And so the most important work of survival happened when the air was still warm, when rivers still flowed, when the land gave freely instead of taking everything back. By the time the first frost appeared, the outcome of winter had already been decided. This is the part of the story most people misunderstand. Viking villages did not scramble when the cold came. They did not panic. They did not react. Because reaction was too slow. Instead, the entire village lived in a constant state of preparation, each day measured against a single, unspoken question: will this help us survive the winter that is coming? Summer was not leisure. It was a race. Fields were worked with urgency that bordered on obsession. Crops were chosen not for variety, but for reliability. Barley, hardy and forgiving, became a cornerstone. It could survive short growing seasons and provided dense energy when the body needed it most. Every harvest was calculated, counted, and stored with precision, because hunger weakened the body and a weakened body surrendered heat faster. Food storage was not about abundance. It was about certainty. Cellars were dug deep into the earth, where temperatures remained stable even as the surface froze. These spaces became thermal vaults, protecting food from both decay and cold. Meat was dried, smoked, fermented. Fish was preserved in ways that turned fragility into endurance. Fat was treasured, hoarded, respected, because fat burned long and hot inside the human body. But food was only one side of the equation. Fuel was life. Long before winter, entire days were dedicated to gathering firewood. Not just any wood, dry wood, aged wood, wood that would burn slowly and evenly. Green wood was avoided. Damp logs were cursed. A poorly chosen fuel could choke a fire with smoke or waste precious heat. Each household maintained reserves that were guarded as fiercely as any weapon. Yet even firewood was not enough on its own. The Vikings understood something modern thinking often forgets. Fire does not create warmth, it releases it. And without a way to capture and control that release, fire becomes little more than spectacle. That is why hearths were carefully designed, positioned, and maintained. Stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Ash was never fully removed, because ash insulated embers and extended their life. The goal was not a roaring blaze. The goal was endurance. Clothing preparation was just as critical. Wool was washed, carded, spun, and woven with a level of care that bordered on reverence. Wool retained warmth even when damp, a trait the Vikings relied on heavily. Layers were planned, not improvised. Garments were repaired before they failed, not after. A torn sleeve in winter could mean frostbite. A soaked boot could mean death. And nothing was discarded lightly. Old clothing became insulation. Worn wool filled cracks in walls. Animal skins lined sleeping areas. Feathers stuffed bedding, trapping heat close to the body through long nights when fires burned low. Even the bodies of the villagers were prepared. Work hardened muscles. Diet built fat reserves. Children were exposed gradually to cold, strengthening tolerance without risking harm. Elders passed on techniques: how to breathe in freezing air, how to move without sweating, how to recognize the early signs of dangerous chill before it became irreversible. Sweat was the enemy. To sweat in winter was to invite the cold inside your own clothing. Vikings learned to work slowly, deliberately, stopping before exertion turned against them. This discipline was learned young and never forgotten. Animals, too, were part of the plan. Livestock numbers were reduced before winter, not from cruelty, but necessity. Only animals that could be fed and sheltered efficiently were kept alive. The rest became food, clothing, tools, fuel. Nothing was wasted. Survival demanded honesty about limits. Those animals that remained were sheltered close, their body heat intentionally captured. Barns were insulated. Walls shared warmth with living spaces. Even the breathing of cattle contributed to the village's thermal balance. Time itself was managed. As daylight shortened, the rhythm of life shifted. Workdays adjusted. Rest became strategic. Night was not fought, it was accepted. Energy was conserved. Stories replaced movement. Social bonds tightened, not from sentimentality, but survival. Loneliness weakened the spirit, and a weakened spirit made fatal mistakes. The village prepared mentally as much as physically. There was comfort in routine, in knowing that each winter task had been done 100 times before. Fear was replaced with focus. Uncertainty was replaced with tradition. When storms came, the village did not ask if they would survive but how long they would last. And that confidence mattered. Because winter tested more than bodies. It tested patience. It tested morale. Darkness crept into the mind as surely as cold crept into the walls. The Vikings countered this with stories, music, ritual anchors of identity that reminded them who they were, and why they endured. Preparation turned winter into a known enemy. But even the best preparation could fail if one thing was lost: heat itself. And in the deepest, coldest months, when fuel ran low, storms blocked access, and the sun barely returned, Viking villages relied on their most dangerous, most powerful secret of all. They did not just create heat. They recycled it. And in the next section, you will see how Viking villages trapped warmth so efficiently that even in the heart of Arctic winter, the cold could not claim what it came for. What if the greatest Viking innovation was not creating heat but refusing to let it escape? By midwinter, the illusion of abundance was gone. The land was silent, locked beneath ice. Rivers stiffened. Storms erased paths and swallowed the horizon. This was the season that exposed lies, punished waste, and rewarded only what truly worked. Fires burned lower. Supplies thinned. And yet, inside Viking villages, life continued measured, deliberate, warm enough. Because by this point, the village was no longer producing heat. It was guarding it. Heat, the Vikings understood, was fragile. It fled at the first opportunity. It rose, leaked, bled away through stone, wood, breath, and time. To survive winter's deepest stretch, every trace of warmth had to be captured, slowed, and reused. The longhouse became a sealed world. Openings were reduced to the bare minimum. Gaps in walls were filled with wool, moss, straw, and clay. Floors were layered with reeds, furs, and skins, insulating feet from frozen ground that could drain heat relentlessly, hour after hour. The earth beneath was not trusted, it was treated as an enemy patiently waiting to steal warmth from above. Roofs carried a hidden burden. Beneath the turf and timber, layers of organic material trapped air, creating a thermal barrier. Air, when still, became insulation. Vikings did not need scientific language to understand this, they saw the result. Interiors stayed warmer longer. Fires required less fuel. Nights grew survivable. And the smoke never fully left. Modern logic demands clean air and quick ventilation. Viking logic valued heat retention above comfort. Smoke drifted slowly upward, escaping through controlled openings, warming rafters and beams along the way. These beams, saturated with heat, became silent reservoirs, releasing warmth back into the space long after the fire dimmed. The house remembered the fire. Heat patterns were studied unconsciously, refined over generations. People knew where to sit, where to sleep, where to store precious items that must not freeze during the night. Cold spots were avoided. Warm currents were respected. The interior became a landscape as complex and understood as the terrain outside. Bodies were arranged deliberately. People did not scatter randomly through space. They clustered. They shared warmth. Children slept between adults. Elders rested near stable heat sources. Physical closeness was not merely emotional, it was thermal strategy. Human bodies generated heat constantly, and that heat was shared, amplified, protected. Movement was minimized. Unnecessary walking stirred air, disrupting thermal layers that kept warmth near the ceiling. Doors were opened only when essential. When they were, everyone felt it, the sudden knife of cold slicing through the room, a reminder of how thin the barrier between life and death truly was. And so they learned restraint. Water was managed with the same care. Ice was not melted unnecessarily. Warm water was used efficiently, often shared. Waste heat from cooking was captured, pots placed where rising warmth could be reused. Nothing warm was allowed to cool without purpose. Even breath was considered. Moisture from breathing condensed on walls and ceilings, forming frost if not controlled. The Vikings balanced humidity carefully, drying air with smoke and heat to prevent internal freezing that could weaken structures and steal warmth from bodies. This balance was fragile. Too much ventilation invited cold. Too little invited moisture and rot. The village walked a narrow line, guided by experience rather than theory. Failure was not abstract, it was deadly. And so knowledge was passed quietly, parent to child, builder to apprentice, through demonstration rather than explanation. The fire itself was treated with respect bordering on fear. It was fed slowly. Never allowed to rage. Flames were tamed, not celebrated. A fire that burned too hot wasted fuel and created drafts that pulled cold air inside. A low, steady heat was the goal, consistent, predictable, controllable. Night was the true test. As darkness deepened, temperatures fell hardest just before dawn. Fires were banked. Embers were buried beneath ash. The village slept lightly, attuned to the subtle signals of danger, the crack of freezing wood, the shift of wind against the walls, the sudden stillness that meant the fire was dying too fast. Someone always listened. Because in winter, warmth could vanish quietly. And yet, despite this constant threat, Viking villages endured months where the sun barely rose, where storms blurred days into one endless night. They did not emerge broken. They emerged intact. This was not luck. It was mastery over loss. But there was still one enemy left, one that architecture, preparation, and heat management could not fully defeat. The enemy that crept not through walls, but into the mind. In the next section, you will see how Viking villages were designed not just to resist freezing temperatures but to keep hope alive when winter tried to break the human spirit itself.